Okay, so one way of understanding forgetting is to use Schachter's seven sins of memory. Another way to understand forgetting is to look at it from the information processing model and to look at each of those stages, encoding, storing, and then retrieving, and see how at each stage something can go wrong, which will make it impossible for us to recall the information later. So first we'll start with encoding failure. One interesting thing about encoding is that as you get older, you actually get worse at encoding. When you compare the elderly brain to the adolescent brain or to the middle adult brain, the elderly brain is actually less active during encoding. And so this is one of the possible explanations for why there is age-related memory decline. There are other things at play for sure, but the elderly brain is less active during encoding, so the slower encoding could lead to some of those memory issues that we see. Another common way that we see encoding failure happening is related back to the absent-mindedness of Schachter's model, which is that our selective attention, whilst usually a really good thing, is actually going to lead to encoding failure a lot of times. In order to process information, we need to be paying attention to it. And with selective attention, what we do is we focus in on one thing and we tune almost everything else out. And so those items which aren't necessarily crucial details at the moment, we can't recall later on because we weren't paying full attention. I'll give you an example to hopefully elucidate this for you. Here we have a bunch of different options for what the penny looks like. Now you have probably seen thousands upon thousands of pennies, and so this is something that should be easy for you. You've held a penny in your hand thousands of times, you've looked at it, and so it should be something that you can just remember immediately. However, hopefully you've been taking a couple of seconds and trying to figure out which the actual penny is. You're going to realize it's not as easy as it should be. Usually when we are interacting with pennies, we're not focusing on where the words are and which direction Abraham Lincoln is facing. Instead, we're just counting out the change. We're paying for, our food, our clothes, we're paying for whatever we're purchasing, but we're not encoding and we're not processing what the penny looks like. That's not the important detail. So now when we try to remember what it looks like, we struggle. So lock in your guess of what the penny actually looks like. And now I'm going to show you what it actually looks like. So if you don't want to see it yet, make sure you hit pause. Okay, so this is an actual penny. We can see it has "In God We Trust" across the top, liberty, date, Abraham Lincoln is facing in that direction. So if we were to compare it to all of our different options, we can see that the correct penny is going to be penny A. That's going to be the penny which was accurate. And most years when I do this with my classes, maybe about 20% of the students will correctly identify penny A, but a lot of people really, really struggle with this one. Okay, so we can see that a lot of forgetting is due just to straight up encoding failure, but sometimes we can be paying full attention, we can be encoding information properly, but we still forget the information along the way, and so this is explained by storage decay. There's a researcher who looked at our rate of forgetting over time, how we lose information we once knew really well, how that information tends to get lost and tends to be forgotten along the way. And so this researcher, Herman Ebbinghaus, we've encountered before. Hopefully that has not decayed in your memory yet. He came up with what we call a forgetting curve. So we already learned about his retention curve. As rehearsal time on day one increases, relearning time on subsequent days is going to decrease. He also came up with this forgetting curve. He studied forgetting in the same way that he studied retention, used lists of nonsense syllables, and he wanted to measure the rate of forgetting. And so what he found it's sort of good news and bad news, that in the early stages, a whole lot of information is lost very, very quickly. However, that's the bad news. Bad news is a chunk of what people learn, they lose almost immediately. The good news is that at a certain point, your forgetting actually levels off. So whatever you can manage to hold on to through that initial stage, you're probably going to maintain for a really, really long time. Now, there's another study which looked at this finding. Performed by Bahrick. We've encountered Bahrick before. Hopefully you can remember he did a study on the distinction between recall and recognition. And on this one, Bahrick looked at retention of foreign language learned during high school. Now, all of you guys had to take a foreign language, and so some of you took Spanish, some of you took French, and your foreign language teachers obviously are hopeful that what you're learning in their class you'll remember for the rest of your life. And Bahrick's research tells us that, well, you have good news and bad news for them. We'll start with the bad news first. Bahrick looked at retention for high school Spanish 3 years out of high school and then 25 years out of high school. He found that 3 years post-high school, a lot of the Spanish knowledge had been lost already. Majority of the Spanish knowledge had been lost already. So in that initial time period, just like with Ebbinghaus, initial forgetting happened very rapidly. Then 25 years later, he revisited this idea, and he found that 25 years post-high school, forgetting hadn't actually increased, that what people had forgotten in the 3 years was all that they actually forgot overall. So yes, that initial chunk of time, you lose a lot of information, but then whatever you've maintained up to that point, you'll probably maintain for almost the rest of your life. So like I said, it's bad news at the beginning, but then it's good news after that. So the question is going to be, what actually causes this memory to deteriorate? What creates storage decay, or what explains storage decay? And so you guys have learned at this point about LTP, or long-term potentiation, which provides a neural basis for learning and for memory in general, that over time you actually create new neural pathways, new strengthened neural pathways. And so we think that your physical memory pathways and memory traces, they physically might actually start to decay over time. And so that is one thing that could explain all these different rates of forgetting. All right, lastly, we have retrieval failure. We've gone over encoding failure, we've gone over storage decay, and then last step of the information processing model is going to be retrieval. So with retrieval failure, first example of this is going to be with the tip of the tongue phenomenon. We talked about this a little bit earlier. And so this is just showing us that sometimes the memory can be fully maintained, the physical memory trace is there, but the access point is really difficult to find. This is why I emphasize to y'all that it's a really great idea to always do elaborative rehearsal, to come up with as many connections and associations with information as possible, to semantically encode whenever you can, to process things based on meaning, because that's going to decrease the likelihood that you will lose a retrieval cue. Now, another way that retrieval failure can happen is if interference occurs. Now, interference is referring to the fact that sometimes learning information, learning new information, can disrupt your recall of other information. And there's actually two different types of interference. We have what's known as proactive, and we have another one what's called retroactive. So first, proactive. Proactive interference talks about the fact that sometimes it's difficult to recall newly learned information because we know the old information so well. So with proactive interference, old information is disrupting new information. An example might be, let's say there's a detour that has recently been set up on your way to school. And so for a couple days, you remember to take the detour and like you're good, and you know that like as opposed to turning right out of your house, you have to turn left because of the detour. So the first couple days, you're remembering correctly. And then fourth day in, you forget and you try to turn the old direction out of your house because you've forgotten the detour exists. This is an example of proactive. Sometimes habits are really hard to shut down. I don't know if any of y'all ever found yourselves going to your old locker as opposed to your new one at the start of the year. Maybe if you switch seats in a classroom, you go to sit down at an old seat, forgetting that you've just gained a new one. So old information is learned so well that we can't quite recall the new information. That's proactive. Retroactive is the opposite. With retroactive interference, new information is now going to interfere with your recall of old information. And so what happens is a replacement of sorts, and that's one of the ways I remember retroactive. The new information has replaced the old info. Both start with RE. And so an example here, if we wanted to look at something school related, maybe you've now learned your new locker combination and you know that one, and so it doesn't make sense to remember your old one because it's been replaced. And so you can try to remember what your locker combo for freshman year is, or sophomore year, or maybe even junior year for my seniors, and you find yourself unable to do that because the new information has replaced that old information. So those are just the two basic types of interference. I'd recommend that you try to come up with a couple of examples from your own life just so you can be sure you fully understand what they are. Now, two researchers have done a study on the different types of interference. Jenkins and Dallenbach actually found that the information that you present in the hour before sleep doesn't tend to be interfered with, or at least it's protected from retroactive interference. And so what they did was they had people learn nonsense syllables, and then they tested their recall up to 8 hours after either being awake or asleep. So you have two different conditions going on here. And what they found was that the forgetting was way more rapid when awake as opposed to asleep, which is demonstrating that we don't just forget information because time has passed. If we just forgot information because time has passed, people would forget the same amount whether they were in the awake trial or they were in the asleep trial. However, since the rates of retention and the rates of forgetting differed, this is showing us that forgetting is more than just decay, but we actually forget a lot based on interference. If you're kept awake, there's a lot of new information that's piling on top of that old information and might be leaving you to forget some of the old info.